Welcome to a story that will make you reflect on the darkest corners of the human soul and the hidden tragedies lurking in places that seem the most peaceful. This is a work of fiction, yet it touches on fears and truths we cannot ignore. Before we descend into the cursed land of Hollow Creek where darkness falls in the most unexpected way, if you're someone who loves deep, dramatic, and haunting stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the gripping content to come. Your support is a tremendous motivation for us to continue bringing you valuable stories. Now, let us return to a not-so-distant past, when the name of a simple farmer became a source of terror and shock across America. The year was 2017, but in Hollow Creek County, deep in the heartland of America, time often felt trapped in a sepia-toned photograph. Fields stretched to horizons blurred by heat, haze, and summer, and etched with the stark lines of winter's frost. This was a land of stoic resilience, of calloused hands and sun-weathered faces, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons and the market price of corn. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and trust was as fundamental as the fertile soil beneath their feet. Until it wasn't. Elias Thorne was a man carved from the very land he tilled. His family had farmed the same 100 acres for 4 generations, their legacy etched in the strong, silent lines of his face and the permanent stoop of his shoulders. His hands, gnarled and powerful, told a story of relentless labor, planting, tending, harvesting, repairing, always fighting against the whims of nature and the volatile whispers of the global economy. At 58, Elias was an anachronism, a holdout against the encroaching tide of corporate agriculture and the digital age. He still used equipment his grandfather had bought, meticulously maintained, and viewed anything with a microchip as a sign of progress he wanted no part of. His farm, Thornwood, was his sanctuary, his prison, and his entire world. It wasn't the biggest nor the most prosperous, but it was his. Every fence post, every creaking barn door, every gnarled apple tree bore the imprint of his family's sweat and dreams. His wife, Sarah, had been the soft counterpoint to his rugged exterior, a woman whose gentle laughter could lighten the burden of a failing crop or a looming debt. Her death 3 years prior from a sudden, aggressive cancer had not just widowed Elias. It had hollowed him out. The silence in the farmhouse after she was gone was a physical weight, pressing down on him, amplifying the rustle of the wind and the creak of old wood. He cooked for one, ate in silence, and felt her absence like a phantom limb, a constant ache that never truly subsided. The preceding decade had been a slow, agonizing bleed for farmers like Elias. A succession of unpredictable weather patterns, late frosts, blistering droughts, torrential downpours at harvest time had decimated yields. Commodity prices, manipulated by forces far beyond Hollow Creek, plunged and soared with capricious indifference. The small family farm, once the backbone of America, was becoming an endangered species. Banks, once understanding, were now faceless entities demanding quarterly profits. Big agricultural conglomerates swallowed up smaller operations, offering buyouts that sounded generous until you calculated the true cost of a lifetime's work. Elias, proud and stubborn, refused to sell. He believed in the land in the old ways. He took out loans, mortgaged what little he had left, hoping for that one miracle harvest, that one good year that would turn the tide. Each year, the tide turned further against him. The interest payments mounted, the calls from Liberty Trust Bank became more frequent, and the friendly tone of Mr. Henderson, the loan officer, hardened into a professional detachment that chilled Elias to the bone. "Mr. Thorne, we understand your situation," Henderson would say, his voice perfectly modulated, devoid of genuine empathy. "But these are business decisions. The bank has obligations to its shareholders." Elias would listen, his jaw clenched, picturing Henderson's sleek suit and polished shoes, so utterly removed from the mud and toil that defined Elias's existence. Henderson represented everything Elias distrusted: the abstract, the corporate, the system that was slowly, methodically strangling him. The final blow came in the spring of 2017. A late, unexpected frost had ruined nearly half his budding corn crop. What little remained was riddled with blight. The market had collapsed for the previous year's stored soybeans. There was no money for new seed, for fertilizer, for the essential repairs his ancient tractor desperately needed. The phone calls from Liberty Trust stopped. They were replaced by official-looking envelopes, culminating in the registered letter, the one with the stark, bold print, Notice of Foreclosure. He remembered the day he received it with chilling clarity. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple, a mockery of the storm brewing inside him. He sat at his kitchen table, the worn oak scarred by generations of family meals, and stared at the paper. His farm, Thornwood, gone. In a matter of weeks, it would be auctioned off. He heard whispers in town Sterling Holdings, a big development company from the city, was sniffing around. They wanted to turn the fertile fields into a sprawling housing estate, erasing centuries of agricultural heritage for cookie-cutter homes and manicured lawns. The thought was a physical blow. They weren't just taking his land. They were taking his history, his identity, his very soul. A profound emptiness settled within him, deeper and colder than the grief for Sarah. It was the emptiness of absolute defeat, of being utterly abandoned by the world he had served so faithfully. But beneath that emptiness, something else began to stir. A slow, hot burn, a resentment so potent it tasted like ash in his mouth. It was a feeling he hadn't known before, not truly. It was pure, unadulterated rage. He remembered a story his grandfather used to tell, about a farmer during the Great Depression who, faced with foreclosure, had burned his own fields to the ground rather than let the bank take them. Elias had dismissed it then as a tale of bygone madness. Now it resonated. What good was land if it couldn't sustain you? What good were laws if they only protected the powerful, leaving the honest man to wither and die? Days bled into weeks. Elias became a ghost in his own home, moving through the motions, but his mind was a whirlwind of dark thoughts. He watched the news, saw reports of booming economies, of stock market highs, of urban sprawl swallowing the countryside. The world was moving on, leaving him behind, not just economically, but morally. He saw the world as corrupt, a vast, intricate machine designed to crush the small, the true, the honest. And he, Elias Thorne, was merely another cog ground into dust. One evening, a week before the official auction, he walked out to his old barn. The scent of hay and machine oil, the familiar creak of the roof, normally brought him a sense of peace. Today it brought a sense of betrayal. He climbed to the dusty loft, where old tools and forgotten heirlooms lay under a thick blanket of time. His hand brushed against a wooden crate, and inside, wrapped in an oilcloth, lay his father's old hunting rifle. A bolt-action, single-shot, well-oiled and cared for. It had a weight, a solidity that felt reassuringly real in his hands. He carried it down, disassembled it, cleaned it, then reassembled it with the practiced ease of a man who understood simple, deadly mechanisms. He loaded a single shell, the brass gleaming dully in the dim light of the barn. The click of the bolt, the cold steel against his cheek, it was a primal connection to a world where problems were solved with direct action, not legal documents and boardroom decisions. He looked out across his fields, now fallow, awaiting their cruel fate. He saw the ghosts of his family, generations of farmers who had loved and worked this land. He heard Sarah's laughter carried on the wind. And he saw Mr. Henderson's smug face, the corporate lawyers, the developers from Sterling Holdings, all eager to carve up his legacy. The rage, which had been a simmering ember, now roared into an inferno. It wasn't just about his farm anymore. It was about all the forgotten farmers, all the broken promises, all the quiet despair that had festered in the heartland. He saw himself not as a victim, but as an instrument, an avenger. The system had broken him. Now he would break the system one piece at a time. The dust would settle, but not before it had been stained red. Elias Thorne, the quiet, unassuming farmer, was about to harvest a crop of vengeance, and America would tremble at the reaping. The first crack in Hollow Creek's placid veneer came on a Tuesday morning in late May. Mr. Henderson, the loan officer from Liberty Trust Bank, a man whose immaculate suits and perpetually pressed shirts stood in stark contrast to the rough-hewn practicality of the county, was found dead in his home. He wasn't just dead. He was meticulously, horrifyingly murdered. His body, discovered by his cleaning lady, was positioned in his armchair, a single antique brass key clasped in his lifeless hand. The key, investigators would later learn, was to the old Thornwood Farm deed box, which Henderson had personally overseen. The cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the chest from a large-caliber rifle, fired at close range, a strangely brutal and intimate act for a man who had made his enemies primarily through paperwork. Sheriff Brody, a burly man with a perpetually furrowed brow and a lifetime of policing Hollow Creek, arrived at the scene with a sinking feeling. Murders were rare here, almost unheard of. Domestic disputes, accidental drownings, even a tragic hunting accident. But not this. This felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. The sheer meticulousness of the crime scene suggested a methodical mind, not a random act of violence. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle. Henderson had clearly known his killer. The small, close-knit community buzzed with whispers. Who would want to kill Henderson? A man whose worst offense was perceived corporate ruthlessness. Brody's initial suspects were predictable. Disgruntled clients, a business rival, maybe a lover's spat gone terribly wrong. Elias Thorne was briefly considered, given the recent foreclosure, but quickly dismissed. Elias was known as quiet, reclusive, a man broken by grief and hardship, not a cold-blooded killer. He was seen as a victim, not a perpetrator. Then, 3 weeks later, another body. Mayor Thompson, a plump, jovial man who had served Hollow Creek for 2 decades, was discovered in his study, a freshly signed land use permit for the Sterling Holdings development clutched in his hand. Again, a single rifle shot, precise and deadly. And again, the strange, symbolic placement. The permit meant that Thornwood Farm, Elias Thorne's ancestral home, was officially earmarked for residential construction. The town, already on edge, spiraled into a fearful frenzy. 2 prominent citizens, both connected to the ill-fated Thornwood Farm, murdered in cold blood. The pattern was undeniable. The media descended like vultures. Local news channels became national sensations. The Hollow Creek Reaper, they dubbed the killer, a chilling moniker that painted an image of a silent, merciless harvester of souls. Fear began to grip the heartland. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. The idyll of rural life was shattered. Sheriff Brody, overwhelmed and out of his depth, had no choice but to call in the big guns. The FBI arrived, led by Special Agent Evelyn Miller, a sharp, tenacious woman in her late 30s, with a mind like a steel trap and an unwavering gaze. She was a city girl, used to the concrete jungles of Chicago and New York, but she carried an innate understanding of human psychology that transcended geographical boundaries. Miller immediately cut through the local gossip and sentimentalities. "Tell me about Thornwood Farm," she demanded, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Tell me about Elias Thorne." She didn't dismiss him as quickly as Brody had. To Miller, a man with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous kind of man. She saw the meticulousness, the symbolism, the clear, undeniable connection to the farm as a motive, not a coincidence. This wasn't just murder. It was a statement. As Miller dug deeper, the portrait of Elias Thorne began to shift from a tragic figure to a potential monster. She learned of his family's long history on the land, his wife's death, the crushing weight of debt, the bank's relentless pressure, and finally, the foreclosure. She uncovered his growing isolation, his refusal to adapt, his deep-seated resentment against the forces he perceived as destroying his way of life. The anger, she realized, had been simmering for years, a slow-burning fuse that only needed a spark. The loss of Thornwood was that spark. The murders continued, each one a chilling message. A representative from Sterling Holdings, the development firm, was found pinned to a tree on the boundary of Thornwood Farm with a pitchfork, a copy of the development plans impaled on his chest. A local councilman who had voted in favor of the development was found drowned in his own bathtub, a bag of soil from Thorne's field clutched in his hands. Each victim was carefully chosen, each death designed to convey a specific, terrifying message. You took my life, I will take yours. Elias Thorne, once a familiar fixture, vanished from Hollow Creek. His old pickup truck was found abandoned miles from the farm, covered in a tarp. His farmhouse, empty and forlorn, became a macabre focal point for the media, a symbol of broken dreams and simmering rage. But Elias himself was a ghost. He knew the woods and fields of Hollow Creek like the back of his hand. Every deer trail, every hidden creek, every abandoned hunting cabin. He was a phantom, moving silently, an expert tracker and woodsman using his intimate knowledge of the terrain as his shield and his weapon. The manhunt became the largest in the state's history. Helicopters crisscrossed the sky, their searchlights cutting through the night. Hundreds of law enforcement officers, K-9 units, and SWAT teams scoured the vast, dense forests and endless cornfields. They found crude traps, tripwires, and camouflaged shelters, evidence of Elias's preparations, turning the familiar landscape into a deadly labyrinth. He was not just a killer. He was a warrior, fighting his own desperate, righteous war against a world that had betrayed him. Agent Miller found herself strangely drawn to Elias's twisted logic. She didn't condone his actions, but she understood the despair that had driven him. He wasn't just killing, he was avenging. He was striking back at a system that had slowly, systematically dismantled his life, piece by agonizing piece. He was the embodiment of rural America's silent scream, amplified into a terrifying roar. The public reaction was a maelstrom. Some viewed him as a monster, a deranged killer who had shattered the peace of a small town. Others, particularly in struggling rural communities across the nation, saw him as a tragic figure, even a folk hero of sorts, a symbol of resistance against corporate greed and a callous government. Talk shows debated the death of the American dream, the mental health crisis in isolated communities, and the widening chasm between urban prosperity and rural decline. Elias Thorne had not only murdered, he had ignited a national conversation, forcing America to confront its own economic and social fault lines. As the summer wore on, Elias became bolder, leaving cryptic messages scrawled on barn walls, defiant declarations against the usurpers and the destroyers of the land. He was no longer just hiding. He was taunting, challenging the authorities to catch him. He believed he was an instrument of justice, not a criminal. And with every passing day, the fear in Hollow Creek deepened, and the legend of the Reaper grew, casting a long, dark shadow over the heartland. Agent Miller knew she was racing against time, not just to catch a killer, but to prevent a desperate man from carving out an even bloodier legacy in the fields he had once called his own. The humid July air in Hollow Creek County was thick with the scent of maturing corn and the acrid tang of fear. The manhunt for Elias Thorne had entered its third month, transforming the pastoral landscape into a war zone. Roadblocks were a permanent fixture, helicopters a constant drone overhead, and the sight of heavily armed FBI agents moving through the fields became as common as the local wildlife. The initial bewilderment had given way to a grim determination in Agent Miller. Elias Thorne was no longer just a farmer. He was a master of evasion, a ghost perfectly attuned to his environment. Miller theorized that Elias wasn't just hiding. He was operating from a base, a network of forgotten tunnels or abandoned structures known only to him. His intimate knowledge of the land, passed down through generations, was his greatest asset. He knew where the old moonshiners hid their stills, where the trappers set their snares, where the drainage pipes from forgotten sawmills emptied into the creek. These were his highways, his sanctuaries. He was a creature of the earth, and the earth was protecting him. The breakthroughs came slowly, painfully. A discarded wrapper from a specific brand of chewing tobacco, found near a freshly laid trap. A single boot print, partially obscured, but distinctive. Miller began to map his movements not just geographically, but psychologically. He moved in patterns, circling back to places of significance. His old farm, his wife's grave, the spot where his great-grandfather had first broken ground. The turning point occurred when a local hunter, desperate to avoid the omnipresent law enforcement, stumbled upon a hidden cache of supplies in an old root cellar deep within a dense thicket of woods bordering the old Thorne property. It contained canned goods, water, a battery-powered radio, and, crucially, a journal. Written in Elias's spidery hand, it wasn't a confession, but a manifesto. It detailed his grievances, his sense of betrayal, his belief that he was merely executing a divine justice against those who had defiled the land and stolen the soul of America. It painted a picture of a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness, not insane, but utterly consumed by a single-minded quest for vengeance. With the journal, Miller had a window into Elias's mind. She understood his targets, his methods, and, most importantly, his potential next moves. He was not finished. The journal alluded to a final reckoning, a cleansing fire that would purify the land. Miller deduced he was targeting the new owners, Sterling Holdings, who were due to break ground on the Thornwood development the following week. The showdown was meticulously planned. Miller knew Elias would return to his ancestral land. It was his anchor, his battleground. A perimeter was established, silent and invisible. FBI snipers took positions. SWAT teams moved in, inch by painstaking inch, through the dense cornfields, their hearts pounding with the knowledge that they were hunting a man who knew every rustle of the leaves, every shift in the wind. Elias, however, was equally prepared. He had seen the early signs of the increased activity, the subtle shifts in the wildlife. He had set his own traps, tripwires connected to bells, crude but effective early warning systems. He watched from the old hayloft of his barn, a sniper's nest he had used since he was a boy hunting pigeons. He saw them coming, a creeping tide of green and black uniforms, encroaching on his final stand. The first shots were Elias's, not at the agents but at the heavy machinery of Sterling Holdings, parked near the fields, ready for the groundbreaking ceremony. He shot out tires, ruptured hydraulic lines, sending bursts of steam and oil into the air. He was destroying their tools, denying them their conquest. The sound of the gunfire shattered the oppressive silence, signaling the final act. A tense standoff ensued. Elias, alone in the barn, shouted across the fields, his voice hoarse but defiant, echoing his journal's sentiments. "You will not take this land. You will not erase us." He spoke of his father, his grandfather, of Sarah, of the generations who had bled into this soil. He was not just defending himself, he was defending an entire way of life. Agent Miller, using a megaphone, tried to negotiate, tried to reason. "Elias, it's over. Put down the rifle. We don't want to hurt you." "It's never over, Agent Miller," he roared back, a chilling laugh following his words. "Not as long as the earth remembers." The standoff lasted for hours, a stalemate broken only by the sporadic crack of Elias's rifle as he targeted abandoned vehicles or distant objects. Psychological warfare meant to unnerve his pursuers. As night fell, a small team of agents, led by Miller, infiltrated the barn from a blind spot Elias hadn't anticipated. They moved with ghost-like stealth, their night vision goggles piercing the darkness. Miller found him in the loft, silhouetted against a dusty window, his rifle aimed at the ghostly shapes of the excavators in the moonlit field. He was humming a forgotten tune, a lullaby Sarah used to sing. He turned, his eyes wide and vacant, as Miller stepped into his line of sight. He didn't raise his rifle. He simply looked at her, a profound weariness etched onto his face. "They won," he said, his voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to his earlier defiance. "But the earth always claims its own." Before Miller could react, Elias made a sudden, unexpected movement. He didn't turn the rifle on her, nor on himself. Instead, he dropped it, and with a surprisingly agile leap for a man his age, he plunged through a gap in the rotting floorboards. He vanished into the dark, forgotten depths of the barn's foundation, a network of tunnels and cisterns he had known since childhood. They heard a splash, a muffled thud. The agents pursued, but the labyrinthine darkness, the hidden passages, and the water-filled cavities proved too dangerous, too disorienting. After hours of searching, hampered by the structural instability of the ancient barn, they found nothing. Elias Thorne, the Hollow Creek Reaper, had simply vanished. His body was never recovered. The official report stated he was presumed drowned in the underground network beneath the barn. His final act a defiant refusal to be captured, to be paraded, to be judged by the system he despised. The aftermath was a media frenzy unlike anything America had seen in years. Elias Thorne, the quiet farmer turned serial killer, became a legend. His story sparked a national debate that reverberated through every stratum of society. Was he a monster, a product of rural isolation and a broken mind? Or was he a tragic figure, driven to extremes by economic hardship and the systemic disregard for the American heartland? Columnists wrote treatises on the death of the family farm. Sociologists analyzed the psychological toll of economic displacement, and politicians scrambled to address the perceived grievances of rural voters. Hollow Creek County never truly recovered its innocence. The farm, Thornwood, became a macabre tourist attraction, its future stalled by legal battles and the chilling legacy of what had transpired there. Sterling Holdings eventually abandoned its plans, unwilling to develop on land now considered cursed. Agent Miller, haunted by Elias's final words, often returned to Hollow Creek. She would stand at the edge of the abandoned Thornwood farm, looking out at the fields, now overgrown with weeds, slowly reclaiming the land. She understood that Elias Thorne's story was more than just a series of horrific murders. It was a brutal, bloody testament to the breaking point of a man, a community, and perhaps a nation. The earth had indeed claimed its own, not just Elias, but a piece of America's soul, leaving behind a chilling question. When does despair turn into devastation, and how many more will be driven to the edge before we truly listen to the quiet cries of the forgotten? The legend of the Hollow Creek Reaper would forever be etched into the fabric of American consciousness, a stark reminder of the darkness that can bloom even in the most fertile soil.